If 2016 taught us anything, it's that plenty of voters are tired of sending the usual governors, senators, and high-ranking government officials to occupy the White House. When the mayor of a mid-sized American city formed an exploratory committee to run for president last year, the reaction from a lot of insiders here was, oh, that's nice. But now, Pete Buttigieg is in position not just to compete, but possibly win the New Hampshire primary. And former Mayor Pete Buttigieg is our guest on Close Up this morning. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you.
So you have far exceeded expectations to this point, but now the bar's kind of been raised, hasn't it? So what do you say to those voters who are looking now at a Joe Biden, an Amy Klobuchar, a Michael Bennet, because they feel that you will need too much on-the-job training to be president?
Well, there's no job quite like the presidency, and I get that. Then again, even though we're more used to seeing senators, you could be a very senior senator in our country and have never in your life managed more than 100 people. When you are the mayor of a city of any size, especially in the strong mayor system we have back home, you understand that your job is not just finding good policies, but building a government and running an administration. And not just that, but leading a population and calling it to its highest values. I actually think that's the part of the job that we are most missing in Donald Trump's Oval Office, and it's part of the job that I seek to recreate and restore. Now, I think it's also the case that we should think about winning. And every single time my party has won the White House in the last 50 years, certain things have been true about the nominee. It's been a nominee who was new on the national scene, hadn't run for president before, somebody who had that values-based message, and somebody who was either new to Washington or didn't work there at all, as well as somebody ushering in a new generation of leadership. So whether you're thinking about it just from the perspective of how do we make sure we win, or thinking about what kind of background is right for the White House, look, the reality is, again, there's no job quite like the White House, but among jobs you can have today in American government, I'd also say there's no job quite like being mayor.
You've been willing to draw some contrasts lately with Vice President Biden, particularly on the Iraq war, but also on the Ukraine issue, when you said that essentially if you had a hypothetical son of adult age, you wouldn't want that person to be serving on the board of a foreign company that is entangled with a foreign policy issue, such as the issue was in Ukraine. I've heard some local Democrats who are saying, I can't believe he's really going there, giving credence to this. Do you regret that at all, or why are you going there with Joe Biden on this issue when you said previously that it wasn't a thing?
I never raise that issue, but when I am asked about it, I'm going to respond. Yes, it would be a good idea to separate those things out. And by the way, I think the Bidens have said that themselves. But what's also important is that we not allow the Trump administration or the Republican Party to change the subject. Nobody has made any credible allegation of wrongdoing or brought any evidence of wrongdoing against any of the Biden family. We're talking about a family that is very well respected, and meanwhile, looking at what this president has done in broad daylight, that is impeachable conduct. So, of course, I would hold my administration to the highest standard in terms of avoiding any conflicts or the appearance of any conflicts, but that's a question for the future about how my administration would work. Let's never allow the Republican Party to change the subject from Donald Trump's abuse of power and misconduct when it comes to this impeachment process.
There is a foreign policy moment underway right now in terms of what's going on or has gone on with the embassy in Baghdad. Do you believe President Trump has acted appropriately thus far in response?
Well, really, I believe that we are seeing the escalation of proxy conflicts in an environment that's being made worse by President Trump's indecision, his inability to establish a stable Middle East policy, the fact that we have policy taking place by tweet, or that he seems easy enough to manipulate that he'll even change what he believes on something as important, sensitive, complicated, and dangerous as the Middle East, is just one more reason why we need a more stable, more responsible president as soon as possible.
Would you hesitate at all to send troops back to Iraq?
Of course. I mean, a president should always think twice about the commitment of U.S. troops. And having myself been sent into war by the decision of a president, I will never allow American troops to be sent into harm's way when there's an alternative. We need to set a much clearer bar and standard for the use of force. And we need to make sure that we're not being dragged into endless conflict. If there is no alternative, if it is necessary to protect American lives, then that's what our military is for. But we also cannot allow these situations to arise that lead to entanglements that are so hard to get out of. I thought I was one of the last troops leaving Afghanistan when I was turning out the lights years ago. We're still there. We're still arguing about how to get out, and that is a strong warning about what to do when other potential conflicts arise.
Back to the 2020 race here. Elizabeth Warren likes to poke fun at the fact that you had a fundraiser in a wine cave. Is she being disingenuous on that front when it comes to these high-dollar fundraisers?
Well, we're talking about somebody who has also had fundraisers at wineries. Look, these process questions, I think, maybe they're good for scoring points in a debate, but this is a conversation about the future of the republic. And it's also a conversation about how to make sure we beat Donald Trump. Now, President Trump and his allies, they are going to pull out all of the stops in order to win. They've already raised over $300 million. I am not a fan of the current campaign finance system in America. It's one of the reasons why I've gone so far as to propose a constitutional amendment to deal with Citizens United. But right now, in 2020, we need to make sure that we go into that struggle with Donald Trump, the political fight of our lives, and not do it with one hand tied behind our back. And so anybody who wants to help make that happen, I want to make sure they feel welcome in this campaign, in this coalition, in this movement that we're building.
Why should a voter trust you, though, on this issue when now Senator Warren is taking such an absolutist position? If you really want to get money out of politics, why not do it like she's doing it?
Well, step one is to make sure that we're in a position to bring about these reforms. And I have led the field in some of my proposals to make sure that we create a democracy that's actually more democratic and worthy of the name. Right now, we've got to make sure that we're prepared. We've got to make sure that we have the resources, and we've got to make sure we have invited everyone who wants to defeat this president into this coalition. I'm not interested in a politics that is defined based on who we reject. I'm building a politics of inclusion and belonging that calls as many people as we can. Because I'll tell you, when we're out on the stump, of course, I'm seeing a lot of Democrats coming to see me speak. I'm meeting a lot of independents, especially here in New Hampshire, and an awful lot of what I think of as future former Republicans, people who will potentially become part of this effort if we make sure we send the signal that we want all hands on deck to replace this president and to launch the era that's got to come next.
You are highlighting environmental policy on this trip, in particular drinking water and water quality as it relates to perfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS, PFAS, however you want to say it. The name's changed a bunch. In parts per trillion, though, this is a patchwork map we're seeing around the country. What would be the standard that would be acceptable for you, PPT, for PFAS?
So the number of parts per trillion should be set by science, not by any politician. What I will do as a policymaker is see to it that we have a science-based standard, and that in addition to standards, we have adequate enforcement. We don't have a leader, I think, in the Environmental Protection Agency today who really believes in environmental protection. We're talking about a former coal company lobbyist in there. Now, as a mayor, one of my most important responsibilities has been to deliver clean, safe drinking water. And, the truth is you're less free to live a good life if you can't rely on the simple fact that water coming out of your faucet is safe and is going to be safe for your family. I think there's a lot of folks, not just in New Hampshire, but certainly here, who have those concerns. And it's one of the reasons why we need to make sure there are strong science-based standards, that there's good enforcement, and that we're investing in research for the road ahead, as well as cleanup. Look, we've already got a lot of contamination out there, and even as these science-based standards come into effect, as they should swiftly, we also got to figure out what to do with what's out there. That's why I would move PFAS contamination into the category of things that need to be addressed in Superfund sites, and increase the resources going into Superfund to make sure that we're able to get that cleanup done.
Could be a monumental amount of money, though, so who pays? Because you're talking about drops in an Olympic-sized swimming pool of contamination when it's 12 or 15 parts per trillion. This is all the federal government's going to foot the bill?
Well, the fundamental principle for Superfund has been that the polluter pays, but we need to make sure that we're ready with federal funding to accelerate those kinds of cleanups, and to make sure that we're doing the kinds of standards, testing, and enforcement to prevent further contamination for the future.
So you have faced some really wild headlines over the last couple of months. There's the Pete Buttigieg is a lying bleep. We can't even say it on TV. Quote, why Pete Buttigieg enrages the young left. You say you can unify the country, but how do you make that argument when there's the Democratic Party? There's a lot of skepticism that you can connect with key constituencies such as African Americans.
Well, the nature of the Democratic primary is it draws out differences, and it draws out all the ways in which you can criticize somebody. But at the end of the day, this is about making sure that we have a message that everyone sees themselves as part of. I have experience in building these kinds of coalitions, both as Democrats and beyond my own party, and that's what it's going to take, not only in order to win the presidency, but in order to govern. This isn't just about bringing an end to the Trump administration, although that is imperative. It's also about thinking about what's next. It's why I always ask voters to picture that first day when the sun comes up and Donald Trump's not in the White House. Think about how divided we're going to be. Think about how much work will be on the president's desk, from dealing with climate change to repairing our democracy to facing the racial and economic inequality we have as a country. That's going to require a different kind of leadership, and I'm going to spend every day until the bell rings communicating my vision for where our country needs to go and for what the presidency is for.
What specifically, though, are you going to do to get votes out of the Senate Republicans? Because it seems like that's as deadlocked of a stalemate, of a cliche that I can come up with there. It's bad.
Well, first of all, as a candidate from the middle of the country who is drawing a lot of different kinds of people into the campaign, I'm not giving up on the idea of a Republican minority in the U.S. Senate. But regardless of whether Mitch McConnell is running the Senate or not, we have this going for us. On issue after issue after issue, even compared to what President Obama had to work with 10 years ago, there is a strong American majority supporting us. From areas where Democrats have always been trusted, like making sure that workers are protected, elevating the minimum wage, and delivering health care, to areas where my party used to be on the back foot. I'm thinking about things like immigration, common sense gun laws, and gun safety policy. There's a powerful American majority to do these things that supports these ideas, even in more conservative states. And so part of what I'll be doing is taking that big blue and white airplane that comes with the Oval Office and flying it directly into the hometowns of these senators and members of Congress who are standing in the way of things that even their own constituents believe must be done. Sometimes if you can't work on a politician, you have to work around them a little bit and speak to the people that they're ultimately accountable to.
All right, Mayor Buttigieg, thanks for joining us on Close Up.
Thank you.
We appreciate your time.